The current federal transportation law that governs our nation's highways and transit systems has been extended so far 9 times since 2009 for almost about 1,000 days. The fact that it's been extended is not a terribly big deal. We've extended the transportation law most of the time before we actually have the reauthorization, but that usually precedes some kind of very robust kind of policy conversation. The conversation around the law this time is very different for a couple of different reasons. One is political. The transportation bill is usually never a very politically challenged or politically charged conversation here in Washington. But this year, even something seemingly as simple as transportation law has been proven to be particularly challenging. There are financial reasons why we haven't done this yet. We've gotten used to reauthorizing the transportation law with way more money than the previous bill, and so lawmakers got used to just increased funds and increased revenue that was being thrown off by the transportation bill, and then the thousands and thousands of earmarks that would go out to congressional districts. Those aren't really part of the conversation this time. So politically things are different, financially things are different, and then in terms of just the network and the transportation challenges across the country, things are very different. We know that the locus of economic power globally is shifting, and so a big emphasis on things like goods and freight movement to places like Asia and Latin America, how that plays out across the transportation system. We know that Americans are actually driving much less. Per capita, we're driving at about the same levels as we were in 1997. So those kinds of needs are completely different than they were. And at the same time, transit ridership and Amtrak and things like that are experiencing record ridership. So it's not a status quo kind of time for doing this. Back in 2010, when it became clear that we weren't going to have a major reauthorization to the tune of half a $500 billion at a 6-year or 5-year kind of clip, we proposed that we not strive for that, but that we stop doing these short-term extensions that are unpredictable and very difficult for state departments of transportation to count on, month after month. If these things are extended for a week or 6 weeks or 6 months, that unpredictability is very challenging for project developers. So the proposal was to pass a 2-year law that would put the bill out past the election, but that would also put in place some critical reforms that really weren't that contentious. There were things that everybody agreed that we needed to do. They weren't going to add a tremendous amount to the overall budget, so we keep the amount of the law the same, and we do some critical reforms. We do things like put together a national freight program. We're one of the only industrialized countries on the planet that doesn't have a national freight program. Obviously, this is a big issue in states and metros across the country. We work on project streamlining. We make sure that we can get projects done quicker without a lot of the red tape while protecting some of the environmental and some of the other critical regulatory stopgaps that are in there right now. We try to do program consolidation. We move from a system that's got 108 federal programs to one that's much more rational and much more streamlined. We take advantage of new innovative funding and innovative finance mechanisms, particularly on the federal level, so that we can do much more with less. So there's a whole host of critical reforms that have to happen that really need to happen in an authorization as opposed to these short-term extensions that just limp from one after another after another. So there's a couple of different things that are holding up the conference, and I think that are preventing there to be this 2-year bill. Some of them are related to the transportation program. There are things that the federal government does now around what they call transportation enhancements, things like bike paths and things that are put in place to diversify the transportation system. There's some contention around that. There's some contention around the national freight program. There's some contention around some of the funding mechanisms. But then there's a lot of other things that are unrelated directly to the transportation bill, like the Keystone pipeline, which is a big deal, and which both sides are dug in pretty tightly about. Whether or not that becomes a bargaining chip or whether or not some of these other things become bargaining chips is still to be seen. But these should not be insurmountable problems. These are issues that we can certainly get beyond. If we were having a serious and rational discussion about transportation policy, we could get these things done. The federal gasoline tax has been the workhorse of the transportation program for years. As Americans drove more and more and paid more in gasoline taxes, it threw off more revenue, and the bill got larger and larger every authorization. And we got used to that for years and years. But then about 10 years ago, it seems things started to change and Americans started driving much less. Those trajectories of increased driving really started to level off and plateau. At the same time, Americans are driving much more fuel-efficient cars, and so the upshot is paying less in gasoline tax, throwing off less revenue. And since the gas tax hasn't been raised in 20 years, it's not even keeping up with inflation. So the bottom line, the upshot of all that is that there is less money that's going into the overall bill, and less money that they can count on that's firewalled to pay for the longer-term reauthorization. We do see states that are starting to innovate on their own. We do see metropolitan areas that are doing projects without federal support. Places like Miami, places like Houston are doing things either with the states and the localities, or with entities like ports and ports authorities, and with the private sector in many cases. So we're seeing that kind of project development starting to happen. And in many other places, particularly in the Intermountain West, we're seeing metropolitan areas go directly to their voters and have them approve revenue measures for certain projects. These are the fast-growing parts of the country, places that are building out all kinds of parts of their transportation system, particularly when it comes to rail transit. And we're seeing these voters pass these things, particularly in a place like Los Angeles that passed a referendum to increase sales tax right in the middle of the recession. That thing passed at a pretty good clip. So this is the kind of wave that we're starting to see, is this self-help kind of attitude, where, again, folks would love Washington to be helpful if they can, but if they're not, they're going to take matters into their own hands.